Hello, Chain Gang. Welcome back to the 4 Chains and the Season 3 premiere of Top 5 Friday. I know you're so excited. Now, I have some news. Since Season 2, I have taken a YouTube course that I paid for, and now I know that the negative stuff does not play as well and does not get as many subscribers, which is why I guess we only have 10,200 and whatever it is. So I know I'm not going to get subscribers, but I just want to get this out of the way, this negativity out of the way on the season premiere. And next week we'll probably do underrated athletes. If you have an idea for a top 5 list you want, just put it in the comments and hopefully we can take care of it. Okay, here we go. Number 5. Now, trying to keep this as positive as possible, I'm not saying these people aren't great. As a matter of fact, if you saw my video on the top 5 greatest baseball players of all time, this person was number 5. So I'm not saying that they're not great. I'm just saying that they are overrated. The top 5 most overrated athletes of all time. And number 5, I hate to say it, I know he just passed recently, and that is Willie Mays. Particularly right after somebody passes, they get stuff added to their reputation as people talk about them in obits. And like I say, he is great. Willie Mays had particularly a lot of praise because he was a 5-tool player, and that's why I have him as my 5th greatest baseball player of all time. He could run. He could field, tons of gold gloves. He could hit for a decent average. He could hit for power. Everything that's in there, Willie Mays could do. I'm just saying that he is overrated, and the reason why I'm saying that is because there are people, knowledgeable, respected baseball people, who have him at number 1. I am approaching this from an historian's perspective. All of the things you hear me talk about today will be from an historian's perspective. I'm not a fanboy. I'm not making emotional decisions based on my allegiance to a player that I particularly like. You may say to yourself, well, you have him at 5, few people have him at number 1. Why is that such a big deal? Well, it depends on the sport. The gap in like hockey or baseball between the greatest player and the number 5 greatest player is just absolutely gigantic. If you're saying Willie Mays is number 1, you're saying he is better than Hank Aaron. To me, it's not really defensible. It's an impossible argument to say that Willie Mays had a more valuable career than Hank Aaron. But you're also saying that Willie Mays is better than Babe Ruth, and that's just preposterous. So why do people say that? Well, part of it I already touched on. It's the romance of it. When Willie Mays played, he played in what I would call the pre-Bill James era, which is when people didn't really understand exactly the sabermetrics behind what a player does on the field and the degree to which it contributes to victories. And what was mostly underappreciated was walks. If you saw the movie Moneyball, you understand that when teams started to understand that more, they had an advantage. Willie Mays only walked 82 times. Only once did he walk over 82 times. Babe Ruth walked over 82 times 14 seasons. Now, if Mays had Babe Ruth's batting average, it would be one thing. Babe Ruth has a career .342 batting average. Not a lot of people remember that. Willie Mays' batting average was good at .302. Anybody's a career .300 hitter, it's a big deal, but far below Ruth. So Ruth walked more, had a higher batting average. Ruth has more home runs, more RBIs, more runs scored, higher on-base percentage, higher slugging percentage. Ruth is ahead of Mays in all of these categories, both on a career total basis, even though he played less seasons offensively, and on a per season basis. The other thing that really separates Mays from Aaron and particularly Ruth is the postseason. Because baseball cognoscenti have such a romantic allegiance to Willie Mays, they completely ignore that he was terrible in the postseason. That could never happen today. Can you imagine with social media? Willie Mays was in the postseason 8 times. 8 complete postseasons, 1 home run. His batting average was .248. To play in 8 postseasons and do poorly in all 8 is simply incompatible with saying somebody was the greatest player of all time. The big statistic these days is OPS, which is you've got your slugging percentage plus your on-base percentage. In the postseason, Willie Mays' OPS was .668. Babe Ruth was 1.214. Ruth was not only considerably better than Mays in the regular season, he was twice as good in the postseason. I mentioned Mays had 1 home run. Babe Ruth retired with the all-time postseason record for home runs. Back then, they just had the World Series, so obviously there's more rounds of the playoffs, so that record's been destroyed. But here's the thing. Babe Ruth also retired with the record for most consecutive scoreless innings pitched in the postseason. He was both the best hitter and the best pitcher in postseason history. People forget what a great pitcher Babe Ruth was. They make fun of the Red Sox because the Red Sox sold Babe Ruth. They make fun of the Red Sox because they didn't play Babe Ruth in the outfield. But think about what a pitcher he was. In 1916, Babe Ruth won 23 games with a 1.75 ERA. Pitched in 44 games, 9 of them were shutouts. In those 44 games, he gave up 0 home runs. He just did not give up home runs. As a matter of fact, in the 6 seasons from 1915 to 1920, he was not only an automatic shutout in the postseason, but in his worst of those 6 seasons, he only gave up 1 home run every 10 games. So if somebody puts Willie Mays ahead of Babe Ruth, there can really be only one reason it's legitimate. Babe Ruth played before the color barrier was broken. We now know with the success of Aaron and Willie Mays and Satchel Paige and Jackie Robinson that black players are great. And Babe Ruth, that is an advantage not having to play against them. What they don't mention is mitigating factors. There were less teams when Babe Ruth played. Why does that matter? Well, every time in any sport there's expansion, the offensive numbers, regardless of the sport, hockey, football, baseball, whatever, explode. Why? Well, think about it. There are now 2 pitchings. Let's say you only add 2 teams to baseball. You're now adding 80 players that were not good enough to play the previous year. You're now adding 2 entire pitching staffs that were not good enough to pitch in the major leagues the previous year, and now they are good enough. And hitters get to hit against those people. So obviously there's a lot of opportunity. The other thing to mention is that when Babe Ruth played, baseball was the sport. If you were making money on your salary and or endorsements, you were either the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, so one person in one sport, or you were a famous baseball player. If you were a great athlete, you automatically went to sports. As football and basketball started to expand, great athletes had their choice of sports, and it was a little bit more diluted in that way. So should the gap between Mays and Ruth close because Ruth played before the color barrier was broken? Absolutely. But it does not make up the difference in the amount of stats that they had at all. Okay, number 4. I'm not saying this because of my feud with the World Wrestling Entertainment Company. We're not getting that solved anytime soon, but number 4 is Bruno Sammartino. Now, Bruno Sammartino is a great guy. His family escaped from Nazi Germany. He has an enormous amount of character. He made career sacrifices because of character. And he's probably the second best person that's been a wrestler to John Cena with 650 or whatever Make-A-Wishes. So and he's legitimate. He's the last champion that won his title on a shoot, meaning a real fight. He really did beat Buddy Rogers, who thought he was going to win that match, and he won the title. He had the record, the Guinness Book of World Records for bench presses, and that'll never be broken because the way you set the record is different now. Back then, you couldn't wear wraps around your wrists or elbows. You couldn't bounce it. You had to rest it on your chest for 2 seconds, and he put up 565 pounds. Arnold Schwarzenegger says he's the strongest guy he's ever worked out with. Those are all legitimate. In terms of being a World Wrestling Federation champion, he's a champion for 2 reigns, but over 4,000 days. Only Hulk Hogan has ever even been at 2,000, and Bruno's at 4,000. Then we start to get into a little bit of the myth. Now, supposedly, Bruno has the record for selling out Madison Square Garden 187 times. But Madison Square Garden keeps internal records, and when Billy Joel recently sold out Madison Square Garden for the 46th time, I'm going through puberty, sorry about the voice crack, they gave Billy Joel the record. Why? Because their internal records show Bruno only sold it out 45 times. I'm sorry to say that, it's just true. But the main reason Bruno's overrated is his matches weren't good. He's just not a very good wrestler. I've watched 40 to 50 of his matches, and he does a headlock, he does a bear hug, and he punches, and that's it. And all of his matches follow the same pattern. He gets ahead, the bad guy cheats, gets on him a little bit, and then he comes back and winds up beating the bad guy. It's just, you can't be the GOAT if your matches aren't good and your wrestling matches. Let's move on, because I like Bruno. I don't want to trash him. Number 3 is Joe Namath. I know everybody loves Joe Namath. He has he's certainly held his fame. He's still doing commercials for longer than any other football player ever. When he was playing, he was probably 50 to 60 times more famous than any other player. He became famous, depending on your age if you don't know, for predicting that his team would win Game 3, Super Bowl III. I don't understand why that was such a big deal. I understand they were underdogs. They were 17-point underdogs. But he plays for the team that was an underdog, and they asked him if he was going to win, and he said he was. Nowadays, you know who does that? 100% of players. It's just not that big a deal. People consider the AFL far inferior than the NFL. The NFL, when they merged and won the first 2 Super Bowls, we found out subsequent to that there really wasn't that big an inferiority between the leagues. So in retrospect, it doesn't look like that huge an accomplishment. Now, to me, when I was growing up, I never understood the prediction thing because already people were predicting it, but I was blown away by having a season of 4,000 yards. Back when you played less games, that was astonishing. He held that record forever, and it was back before there was pass interference, which made it even a bigger deal. Joe parlayed that Super Bowl and that huge season into huge fame. He was in a ton of commercials. I remember he was famous for being in a commercial with Farrah Fawcett from Charlie's Angels. He was in movies with Anne Margaret and other stars. And he, as I say, has continued to be in commercials. The problem is he just wasn't a great quarterback. He had a strong arm, but he wasn't very accurate. He got sacked a lot. He didn't have good field vision. Let's take a look at the 1967 season, which was thought of as the best single season that any player at any position had ever had. Threw for 4,700 yards. 1,434 of those were to Don Maynard. Now, Don Maynard was a better player than Joe Namath. Don Maynard had great hands and was so much faster than any defensive players back then, he could simply outrun them. So as a consequence, people learned very soon you had to have one guy essentially cover him one-on-one, and then you had to have a free safety keeping at least 10 yards distance, so when he passed that first guy, you would have a shot of defending it. Consequently, double teaming receivers was incredibly rare back then because running game was so much more prominent. But what this did was it freed up every other receiver was being single covered, and you had situations where linebackers were covering wide receivers and tight ends, and that's just a big advantage. So Don Maynard had huge stats, but also all of the other receivers had much better opportunities. That season, he didn't just break the record for passing yards, he break for passing attempts. He had already set that record the previous year, and this season he threw 491 attempts. But curiously, he didn't have the most touchdowns. He was number 5 in touchdowns, but he was number 1 in interceptions, threw 28 interceptions. So a lot. He led the league in interceptions 4 times. He only led the league in touchdowns once. And the year he led it was 1972. He had 19 touchdowns. That was number 1 in the league. He had 21 interceptions that year. Overall, he had 173 touchdowns and 220 interceptions. Granted, there was no pass interference back then, but there were plenty of quarterbacks that had more touchdowns than interceptions. Joe Namath's completion percentage for his career was 50.1. Not unbelievably terrible, but certainly not compatible with being the great quarterback that he's known as today. But there is a big gap between number 5, number 4, number 3, and our top 2 most overrated players, because they're overrated to an extent that just makes it absolutely ridiculous. Both great players, but both not even in the stratosphere of matching their reputations. Let's start with number 2. It's Alexander Ovechkin. Now, this is dangerous for me. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. He is beloved, and this is a common conversation, because he is poised, for those of you who don't know, to break Wayne Gretzky's all-time record for goals in a career. Even if you know nothing about hockey, I know that you know Wayne Gretzky. So how could he be overrated? How could anybody that breaks any Gretzky record be overrated? Especially the goals record, arguably the second most important record to the scoring record. I can only get something like, well, I'm not saying Ovi, that's what they call him around here. Ovi is a better all-around player than Gretzky, but if he passes him in goals, that just means he's the greatest goal scorer of all time. I understand that stars bring ratings. I understand why the media is giving Ovi so much attention, because Gretzky is still the most important hockey player in the league, even though he hasn't played for a couple of decades. But the chance to actually have somebody beat a Gretzky's record is huge. If I was a director, I would say focus on this. But I just can't look the other way of how ridiculous it is. Not only will this not make Alexander Ovechkin the greatest goal scorer of all time, it would be a stretch to say he's one of the top 5 goal scorers of all time. Let's tackle the overall issue about how bad he is at non-goal scoring, because that is the low-hanging fruit. He is a good goal scorer, but he's a terrible passer and a terrible defensive player. We'll talk passing first, because I think that's easier to convince you. He's a big guy, so there's an assumption that he's a good defensive player, but he just isn't, and I'm going to prove that to you. He scores a lot of goals, as I said, and that has resulted in the Washington Capitals having the best record 10 times. But they've only won 1 Stanley Cup. And as a matter of fact, there have been numerous seasons where they've had more points than anybody in either league and have been knocked out in the first round. And the reason is because during the regular season, you're playing a different team every night. It's harder to game plan. When you're playing Ovi in the playoffs, he's a liability. Why? Because you know he's not passing. Just make sure that he doesn't get a good shot on goal, and you're golden. There will be wide open players that will just sit there twiddling their thumbs while Ovi tries to score another goal. Ovi has never been in the top 10 in assists, not once. Gretzky has been number 1 in assists 16 seasons. 16 times he has led the league in assists. If you look at the top 20 seasons of all time, Gretzky has 19 of the top 20 assist seasons of all time. Only Mario penetrates that. Ovi has never had over 60 assists in the seasons, and obviously Gretzky has done that 20 times. Defense is tough to judge in any team sport. It's particularly tough in hockey. It's the hardest because if you're judging non-goalies, because goalies have such a huge impact on the statistics of a team defensively. Here's a good way to tell how good a defense of a player is. Coaches see them in practice, and they see them in games, and when you're a coach, you're tracking plus minuses during every shift. So you can look at how many shorthanded goals a player scores as a way of judging their defense. Why? Well, it's much easier to score during a power play than a shorthanded goal. Now, Ovechkin's 6'3", 238 pounds. As I mentioned, there's an instinct to say, well, this guy's a good defensive player. In his rookie year, that's what his coach assumed, and he did play more shorthanded shifts in his rookie year than any other season. But in 80 games, he only scored 3 shorthanded goals. And the Caps had a terrible rating on shorthanded shifts with Ovi in the lineup. So coaches started to realize that. So after those 3 goals that he scored in his rookie season, he has played 1,353 games since that. And in 1,353 games, he has scored, wait for it, 2 shorthanded goals. 2 shorthanded goals in 1,353 games. He's had different coaches in that time, but they've all drawn the same conclusion about Alexander Ovechkin. He's a liability defensively. Gretzky had the opposite trajectory. He weighs 50 pounds less, 185 pounds. It was assumed that he would be a liability defensively, so in his rookie season, he was played very sparingly in shorthanded situations and only had 1 goal. But then, as they're looking at the statistics, they realize the opposite of Ovi. His puck handling, his never equaled anticipation of where a puck would be going made him very valuable defensively. And then he became the all-time leader in shorthanded goals. And in fact, in a 6-year stretch, he led the league in shorthanded goals 5 times. He is a great defensive player. Ovi is one of the worst. Now, we talked about the goals. Let's talk about assists. If Wayne Gretzky had never scored a single goal, he would still be hockey's all-time leading scorer. But Gretzky did score a goal. In fact, he's the all-time leader in goals, as we mentioned. Presumably, Ovi's going to pass him late this season or early next. But let's dive a little deeper into those goals. The easiest way to score goals is on the power play. But hockey players don't play the whole game. You have to choose when they're playing. And Gretzky, as we said, is very valuable defensively, so he's always playing shorthanded situations and less power plays. Ovi is always in on the power play when his defensive liability is much less important. So Ovi is the all-time leading power play goal scorer. Gretzky, the overall all-time goals leader, is only 18th in power play goals. That is a huge disparity. Gretzky has, as we mentioned, the most shorthanded goals ever. Alexander Ovechkin has the worst games played to shorthanded goals of any non-goalie in the history of the National Hockey League. And keep in mind, Ovechkin's a left winger. So there are defensive players that are not even supposed to be scoring on a regular basis, and not a single one of them has a worse record than Ovi does with a minimum of 500 games played. Ovi, because he's not passing, is shooting when he shouldn't, all the time. He is the all-time leader in shots taken. As of this writing, it's at the beginning of the season, Alexander Ovechkin has 854 goals on 6,659 shots. Gretzky has 894 goals on 5,088 shots. So Gretzky has 40 more goals on 1,571 less shots than Ovi. So even if Ovi passes him in goals, he's not just not a better overall player, he's nowhere near the goal scorer Gretzky was, regardless of what his career total winds up. Let's dive down into the statistics, how that plays out. Ovi's best season, most efficient, he made 15.4% of his shots. Gretzky had a stretch of 7 seasons where 6 times in those 7 seasons he made over 20% of his shots. We mentioned the postseason. I'll touch on it briefly. The disparity in results between Ovi and Gretzky in the postseason, just like the Ruth Mays comparison, huge. Ovi has only had 2 postseasons where he scored 5 goals. Not postseason series, total postseasons, he scored over 5 goals twice. Gretzky's done that 9 times. Ovi's best postseason status, he has 10 game-winning goals. Gretzky is the all-time leader in game-winning postseason goals at 24. Gretzky is also the all-time leader in total goals, assists, and points. Alexander Ovechkin is the most overrated hockey player of all time, and he would be number 1 on the list if it weren't for the worldwide delusion that is Kobe Bryant. I want to be clear. I understand this is the most emotional issue I'm going to be talking about. I want to make it clear that if you think I'm wrong about this, you're going to say something very emotional that is just not accurate or relevant. Let's be clear. Kobe's a great player. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. I'm not saying he's overrated because he sucks or he shouldn't be a Hall of Famer. I'm saying he's overrated based on the negative reaction that I got because I did not place him on my list of the 5 best non-centers to ever play in the NBA. If you want to know, I've got Kobe as the 12th or 13th best non-center. You can watch both the center and the non-center videos if you want to know why I separate the two. If you want to go overall, I've got Kobe somewhere between 17 and 19. That's not an insult. We're talking about career value here. I want to be very clear. I have Kobe still ahead of Giannis. I have him ahead of Luka. I have him ahead of Joker. All three of those players are playing at a much higher level right now than Kobe ever did at his peak. But Kobe sustained that level for a much higher thing, so much longer period of time. So I do have Kobe ahead of him, more rings, etc., etc. Of all of the players that are in the top 20, that anybody's top 20, none of them are anywhere close to as inefficient a player as Kobe Bryant. Why am I saying he's overrated? There are people that think Kobe Bryant is the greatest player of all time. The more common, I would say the most common ranking I see him at is number 2. People say he's the closest thing to Jordan. I've got Jordan as the greatest player of all time, and a lot of people have Kobe second. Now, obviously, when somebody dies early, young, tragically, which he certainly did, it tends to increase their level. I am talking about comments that have been made since Kobe's death, because since his death, he has become a much, much, much greater player in the eyes of the public. Magic Johnson even called Kobe the greatest Laker of all time, which is crazy because, oh, by the way, you're Magic Johnson. You are a much better player than Kobe Bryant. It's not even close. Not even talking about Kareem or any of those other players that should be ahead of him. I'm going to stick to a simple argument. I could literally talk to this for 3 hours, but let's just talk about Kobe versus LeBron. Because most of the times when people are making the Kobe argument, they're making it in comparison to LeBron. So let's take the categories that players are judged. Kobe is a better defensive player in my book. There's been a lot of scholarly input lately that says that Kobe is never penalized when he goes for steals. When you get steals, it increases your defensive rating. But when you dive for them and leave your team outnumbered defensively and you don't get the steals, that doesn't affect your defensive rating negatively. Kobe, but people are voting, and Kobe was voted, first team defensive team 12 times and LeBron only 6. So let's give Kobe a slight edge on defense. Rebounds. Kobe averaged 5.2 rebounds a game, and LeBron sits right now at 7.5. So LeBron's a 43% better rebounder. Kobe averaged 4.7 assists per game, and LeBron averaged 7.4. So LeBron's a 74% better passer. Statistically, I'm going to argue that the statistics are deceptive, and that the difference between LeBron and Kobe as a passer is even larger, but we'll get to that later. When we're talking about assists and rebound edges, it's both per game and total basis. LeBron has over 11,000 assists. It's number 4 all time. It's more than Magic Johnson. Kobe has 6,306, so about 5,000 less. He's number 35 all time. Depending on when you watch this, he might be number 36 because Steph Curry is still active and a little behind him. Kobe is number 126 all time in rebounds. LeBron is number 30. So LeBron is better on a per game basis and on a total basis. The real difference then has to be scoring, because the slight difference in defensive ability certainly doesn't compete with the rebounding and the passing. But here's the thing, the difference between LeBron as a scorer and Kobe is actually larger than the distance in rebounds and close to assists. And let me tell you why. LeBron is the all-time leading scorer with 40,000 points. And Kobe is 4th at 33,643. So why is Kobe considered a better scorer, which he absolutely is by almost everybody? Maybe it's average per game. Let's see. LeBron career average is 27.12 and Kobe's at 24.99. So LeBron is far ahead in points and far ahead in points per game. So that leaves only one thing, which is efficiency. Is Kobe a more efficient scorer than LeBron? How many regular seasons, try to guess, how many regular seasons do you think that Kobe made more shots than he missed? Made at least 50% of his shots. What's your guess? All right. It's 0. Never has he scored 50% of shots. In fact, he's never even made 47% of his shots. How many seasons has LeBron made 47% of his shots or more? 20. 20-0 on efficiency. A much, much better scorer than Kobe Bryant. And here's the thing. I've watched, it's not just stats, I've watched hundreds of Kobe games. I'm a Lakers fan. Kobe led the league in shots attempted 6 times, and LeBron has never led the league. People use that to support LeBron, but the truth is, Kobe is a 44% shooter. If there's nobody on his team that's making more than 44% of his shots, then Kobe should not be passing it to a less efficient shooter. Their best chance is 44%. So that could conceivably explain why he takes so many shots. But Kobe played a long period of time with Shaquille O'Neal. And Shaquille O'Neal was the most efficient scorer in the league, arguably the most efficient scorer of all time. Of the 8 seasons that Shaq played with Kobe, he led the league in shooting percentage 6 times. Shaq's worst shooting percentage playing with Kobe was 56%. That season, Kobe was under 42%. So with Shaq at his worst, he was 14% more efficient than Kobe. Kobe needed to be passing the ball and not taking those impressive-looking highlight shots. I recently saw a post, I'll try to find it and put it up here, that Kobe's the all-time leader in mid-range unassisted jumpers. That kind of supports my point. Kobe missed 60% of his mid-range unassisted jumpers. 60%. He just took the most unassisted jumpers when he should have been passing the ball to Shaq or Paul Gasol or Dwight Howard or somebody who was more efficient, which most people were. The other thing that people brag about is that Kobe's the best bad shot maker of all time, better than even Jordan. But here's the thing, Jordan is much more explosive than Kobe, much more athletic than Kobe. Watch Jordan play. He can get himself free, square his shoulders to the basket, particularly like in that shot, Game 7 shot against the Jazz, and make a not bad shot that goes in a much higher percentage of the time. Now, Kobe takes 6 awkward falling away shots while Shaq's sitting under the basket uncovered. But if all you judge it on is SportsCenter, you're just seeing the one shot where he's falling out of bounds and it made it, and it makes the SportsCenter top 10. People who get their knowledge from highlights think Kobe was way better than he is. Let's talk about the third argument that I've seen recently on Facebook. Kobe scored 60 points in his final game, but he wanted to go and do other things like go to Hollywood and win an Oscar, which he did, very impressive. But if he wanted to, he could have kept playing and put up numbers that LeBron couldn't touch. Well, I watched that last game. As I said, I'm a Lakers fan. I had goosebumps for most of the game. By the end of the game, I was crying. It was incredible. But if you watch it back, not exactly a defensive clinic. It was a meaningless game. Didn't matter which team won at all. His teammates were not shooting the ball. They were passing it to him at every possible opportunity. Was that game indicative of his last season? Could he have continued to play? Well, in his last season, he made 35.8% of his shots, averaging 3.7 rebounds and 2.8 assists. He was done. There was no more Kobe Bryant. It would have just gotten worse. Now, let's bring this to the second delusion about Kobe that people use. And that delusion is known as either Kobe time, Kobe when people are shooting trash into the trash can, or Black Mamba time. And that is the general impression that, yeah, okay, maybe he wasn't a great shooter in the regular season, but in the playoffs when it mattered, when it was Mamba time, Kobe stepped up. Now, I don't know what you mean. Do you mean the playoffs? Do you mean the finals? Do you mean elimination games? Whatever is when it's important. You think that Kobe took it to another level. He did, but it was a level down. The more important the game, the worse Kobe Bryant did. Okay, well, forget about impressions. Let's just talk about statistics. I asked you how many regular seasons Kobe made half his shots. How many postseasons? Not series, not games. How many total postseasons did Kobe make half his shot? The answer is the same. It's 0. LeBron has made half his shots during the postseason 9 times. Shaq has made half his shots during the postseason 16 times. That's another delusion I don't even have time to get into. I've yet to see a list, other than mine, where Kobe was ranked below Shaq since Kobe passed away. Nobody thought that when Kobe was alive. They played together in 3 finals. Shaq won the MVP of those finals all 3 times. When Kobe forced Shaq out, because he wanted to be a star, his team turned crap. Look at their ratings when Shaq was gone. He thought, I just need a center. I can replace Shaq with Dwight Howard or whoever, and I can become the focus, and we can kick butt. Well, he didn't kick butt. it wasn't until he got great players back around him, when he realized how important it was to his legacy, that he wound up winning titles again. Kobe's first experience in the postseason, he threw, what was it, put it in the comments, 4 or 5 air balls in Game 7. It looked like the Lakers were going to win, and they pulled defeat from the jaws of victory, and he just kept throwing up air balls in the fourth quarter and passing up people that were wide open. Kobe got worse in the playoffs. He got worse in elimination games. He got worse in Game 7. The myth that there was Black Mamba time is exactly that, a myth.
Okay, the final argument is that when they were both great, the voters thought Kobe was the MVP. Well, actually, this is Kobe's only MVP. He won 1 regular season MVP and 2 finals MVPs against LeBron, who did that 4 times. But in my opinion, LeBron should have won a lot more. Sometimes when somebody hasn't won an MVP, prior to the season, the people just decide that they're going to win it. And this is one of those cases. LeBron had more points, he had more rebounds, he had more assists, and he shot with far greater efficiency, but they gave it to Kobe anyways. What will make the MVP top 5 terrible decisions happened 10 years later to LeBron, when they just decided that James Harden was going to be the MVP. Now, he did score more points than LeBron, but LeBron had way more rebounds, had more assists, and shot with almost 10% higher field goal percentage. And the other thing is, James Harden only played 72 games to LeBron's 82 games, which is why I think this decision is even worse.
Anybody who thinks Kobe Bryant is one of the 5 or 10 best players of all time is making that choice on emotion, and there are not facts to support it. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. I want to turn this positive, so next week it's going to be the most underrated athletes of all time, and then you guys will go back to loving me. I love you either way, even the people that get angry at me, and we will see you next time on The 4 Chains.